Polycon.ca is a website which focuses on news, analysis, and opinion about Alberta's political economy. In today's discussion, I talk with Professor of Political Science, Dr. Jarrett Wesley of the University of Alberta. Wesley is one of Alberta's preeminent political scientists who is a frequent media commentator about the Alberta political scene. He is a prolific author, including his book, Code Politics, which compare political cultures of the three prairie provinces, and Big Worlds, which examines elections in Canada's provinces and territories. Professor Wesley leads the Common Ground Initiative and co-leads the Viewpoint Alberta project. He's worked for 6 years in the Provincial Executive Council, advising both Progressive Conservative and NDP premiers. I have known Jarrett for about a dozen years, and I'm a fan of his analysis of Alberta's political scene, as you will tell from the conversation. Which brings us to today's conversation topic, the state of democracy in Alberta. In a May 6th article in the Tide, entitled Why the UCP is a Threat to Democracy, he argues there's no hard and fast line between democracy and authoritarianism. Just ask people from autocracies. You don't simply wake up one day under arbitrary rule. His case is built on 4 pillars which are integral to healthy democracies. 1, the rule of law. 2, checks and balances. 3, the integrity of the electoral process. And 4, distribution of power. He concludes with suggestions for civic engagement necessary to push back this disturbing trend in legislation centralizing power in the provincial cabinet and the premier's office. Welcome, Jarrett.
Thanks for having me, Bob.
Perhaps you could provide a little bit of background on your research interests and how your research has contributed to your call for action against Premier Smith's authoritarian leanings.
Yeah, I mean, we started the Common Ground project motivated by a pretty specific research question, and it was this: is Alberta as conservative as everybody thinks it is? Because this, a lot of us academics in Alberta, it's almost a ritual after every municipal election in which a progressive mayor is elected to a big city like Edmonton or Calgary, or in the case of the 2015 provincial election, New Democrats win. We're often asked, "Wow, does this mean that Alberta has changed into a progressive paradise?" And my answer is always, "Well, no." But we didn't really have any data to show whether Alberta's conception of itself was really accurate, right? And so we started off motivated by figuring out, is Alberta really as conservative as we think it was? And we found that really we were asking the wrong question. We needed to start asking, do Albertans' attitudes on the individual level match up with their conception of themselves as a community, right? In other words, are Albertans who they think they are?
Mm-hmm.
And that's where our research has really evolved over the last 12 months or so, as we've used surveys to figure out where Albertans are on public policy issues, on ideology, on identity issues. We find from those surveys that Albertans are really quite moderate when we ask them a series of questions like, which of the following labels would you identify with? We give them libertarian, populist, moderate, conservative, progressive, socialist, and so on. The most common answer is moderate. Over 56% of Albertans identify as moderate in one way, shape, or form. 44% identify as conservative, and 43% identify as progressive. Now, listeners to your podcast will be good at math and realize those don't add to 100, and that's because identity is multifaceted. And in fact, 8 out of every 10 Albertans, 80%, identify as both progressive and conservative. And when I deliver talks like this one to folks down south of the border, their heads explode to think of what it means to be both progressive and conservative. But Alberta, as you know, was governed by a progressive conservative party for 40 years. And that it becomes part of the individual and collective psyche of the province. So that's, where we started the research. And I was just joking with one of my colleagues when we're writing papers about populism in Alberta and conservatism. We have to do a literature review, as you know, right? And it wasn't, 2 years ago that I was able to skip over vast amounts of research or vast amounts of sections of research because they were dealing with developing countries that were facing authoritarian regimes, right? Not that we care about those, but they weren't really applicable to conversations about what conservatism and populism are in Canada or in Alberta. And I'm now having to go back and revisit those because I think, like a lot of Canadians, like a lot of Albertans, I became complacent with the notion that far-right politics had no place in Canada. I am as guilty as anyone in buying into the mosaic myth, for example, that Canada is a mosaic multicultural country, and we are, as a result, immune to discussions around, overt racism or covert racism in the form of voter ID laws, for example. But the UCP has changed my mind. And I got asked before, like, what's in another conversation, what's the role of a political science? Like I said, I didn't get into this business to have conversations like this with you, Bob, as much as I enjoy talking with you. This isn't what I did this for, but it's become an obligation for those of us that are trained in looking at what conservatism is. What are the boundaries of democracy, right? What are what is politics as usual versus, drifting towards authoritarianism? And, especially with Bill 18 and 20, but not starting with them, I see it as part of my role to ask questions and to tell folks what are the implications if we continue down this road. And, before we move on to another question, I do want to make it absolutely clear. While I do think that the UCP is an authoritarian force in Alberta, I'm not suggesting that Alberta is a totalitarian state or that the UCP is, a Putin-esque organization. That's not what I'm saying at all. As you said in the opening, I believe that, democracy and authoritarianism are at opposite ends of the spectrum. And Albertans have to decide how far down to the authoritarian side of the spectrum we want to go. And one of the things I keep reminding folks is, eventually, if you go too far, you don't get to make the choice to go back. And while I don't think we're quite at that point, we are at a pivotal moment where we have to ask ourselves, what do we want out of this democracy?
Right. And one of the interesting things about your article in the Tie, Jared, was that this is not just simply Danielle Smith, that there were certainly indications under the former Premier Kenney about some degree of authoritarian traits in terms of especially electoral type politics and the sacking of the election commissioner. Can you maybe talk a little bit about that? And I'll just raise another issue that's really currently coming to the fore, and that is the recent appointment of the ethics commissioner who was running to be a candidate for UCP, and also the current search by the Legislative Assembly for a new chief electoral officer. I mean, how worrisome is this?
Yeah, and I talk with a lot of people who, if they look at these incidents as one-offs, would say, "Oh, that's just politics as usual." I've talked with some former progressive conservative cabinet ministers who say, your points about the UCP making patronage appointments, that's just politics as usual. But more broadly, people will say to me, Jared, what you're talking about is the consolidation of power, and all politicians, all parties, once they get into power, look to consolidate power within their offices. And I don't disagree. We've got a book coming out about party loyalty in Canada, for example, that talks about, that's been a steady drift to more concentration in the power of the leader, in the hands of the leader, and so on. But what I'm talking about is qualitatively different. It's not just a degree of consolidation of power, it's the elimination of dissent. That's when we start to head down the path towards authoritarianism. And in political science terms, we call this pluralism, right? In liberal democracies like Canada, we believe in the concept of pluralism, which broadly defined means many voices result in better debates and ultimately, a better sense of the public good. And so, following the American example, following some British examples, we built institutions that were there to provide checks on the consolidation of power, but also to allow for voices of dissent and for, in some cases, independence of government bodies to execute certain elements of public policy that we believe should be beyond partisanship. Those are agencies, boards, and commissions. But also to give the power to the legislature to appoint, officials who could act in watchdog roles, like the ethics commissioner, elections commissioner, that provide MLAs, in Alberta's case, with broader power to check the power of government that lies outside of their day-to-day world that is just dominated by partisanship and party discipline. And so while, patronage appointments to some of these agencies, boards, and commissions has been around in Canada for years. We can debate whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. But it's when these appointments happen as a means of trying to shut down dissent or to shut down checks and balances on the government's power that we have a real problem. And I'd argue that there is actually a pattern of this happening in Alberta, starting with the firing of an election commissioner in the middle of an investigation into the Premier's leadership campaign. That doesn't pass the smell test. But even if that were a one-off, we might exclude it, or excuse it. But it's a pattern with this party, right? And I think it's time that we start going beyond the individual episodes and scandals, and connecting the dots to say we have a problem with this party.
Right. And one of the points that you make as one of the key pillars is an election system that you can trust. And there was a difference, a qualitative difference between the 2019 election, where you had quite a detailed platform by the UCP and generally support of that program going forward, with a few significant gaps, which I've written about, such as public sector pensions. Again, no mention of that, no mention of the CPP, no real mention of a quasi-separatist agenda. Then we come to your article and to the 2023 election, and as you point out, what's very disturbing is we're not going to talk about, or we're not going to run on an APP, a provincial police force, etc. So, and this leads to a lot of mistrust or distrust of elected officials. So and it leads to a lot of cynicism, obviously, about political conduct and leadership and so forth. What are the potential dangers in the electoral machinery if a partisan appointment is made? And I'm thinking towards the 27 election.
Yeah.
Have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, I'll come to that in just a second, but I think that your lead-up comments are actually important to highlight too. I mean, governments should be free to address problems that they didn't realize were there when they campaigned for office, or that they have to address something like a pandemic that happens in the middle of their in the middle of their governing term, right? I mean, things happen. I think some of us start to ask questions when the leader of the party was asked point blank, are you going to advance on these issues? And she says no. And then, a number of months later starts advancing on those issues. That becomes problematic. It erodes trust. And it smacks of hypocrisy, quite frankly, when, the UCP campaigned in in 2019 on the New Democrats' failure to campaign on a carbon tax, right? I mean, that was a principal part of their campaign, and now they are, in my view, keeping more promises than they make, and they're working on parts of an agenda that weren't part of an election platform, and instead of actually, fulfilling the promises that they made to Albertans on a whole, right? But there, I'm actually a little bit more optimistic. I think that the internal grassroots part of the UCP apparatus will actually hold her to account in the leadership review this fall. They've already started, right? Those of us that follow, right-wing Twitter in Alberta will realize that they've got a checklist, and they're noticing that they're not hearing anything about the promises that were made to Albertans on tax relief for number one, and the Premier said we're not moving on that. There's a whole bunch of other promises that the Premier has now had to come out publicly and say, well, we've got data saying that we're moving on 75% of these right now. I don't know where they come up with those figures, but it's to me an indication that people are starting to notice within the party that they're keeping more promises than they made, and they're working on things that Albertans didn't ask them to, and they didn't poll Albertans on before. But the more parties do this, of course, the less Albertans tend to trust them when it comes to elections, and that's one thing. A lot of people tune out of politics because they think no politician is trustworthy. They lie to get elected, and so on. I just saw data coming out of our most recent Viewpoint Alberta survey that shows that 80% of Albertans strongly agree that politicians will say anything they can to get elected, and they're not above lying. That's a problem, and that's not easily solved. But to your point about trust in the electoral process, we don't want to end up in a situation like they have in the United States, where we've seen the erosion of a principle called losers consent, right? A lot of people don't realize that elections are really based on the honor system in Canada. We all agree that when votes are counted on election night or the day after, that the loser will concede and wish the victor the best on behalf of the community, and we all move on. We've seen in the United States that is something we shouldn't take for granted. And the more we see politicians and activists starting to throw into question age-old principles and institutions in our elections, the more we should be worried. And it's now become part of the government's policy, right? So with Bill 20, they've suggested they're going to get rid of vote tabulators. Based on what evidence? None. Based on a feeling that and quite frankly, misinformation and disinformation and conspiracy theories from south of the border, we're going to get rid of that. I think that's a red herring in that piece of legislation that is designed to distract us from the real pernicious part of that bill that nobody seems to be talking about, and that is voter ID. So they have, in this bill, done away with, in Bill 20, have done away with vouching as a means of providing your identity or verifying your identity to vote. And for folks that aren't familiar, this is a process where you find somebody who has proper identification to go to the polling station with you and tell the person at the door who's taking the register, I believe this person is who they say they are, and they're eligible to vote. It's worked in Canadian elections for decades. We have in Alberta only 7 cases of voter fraud over the last decade. All of them were caught, involving 5 people, and none of them involving the process of vouching. This process works, and over 100,000 Albertans have used vouching at one point or another in their lives. Either they've been vouched for or they've done the vouching. It's 8% of the electorate. This system works. They want to do away with this and impose voter ID requirements on anybody who shows up to the polls. And a lot of people would say, well, I have ID, I have a driver's license. What's the big deal? Everyone should be able to have a driver's license. Well, the point is they don't. And even beyond that, we have no idea how many people don't. My estimates are anywhere between 10 and 50,000 people. And that's based on a study that was done by the chief electoral officer federally, who said there's at least 100,000 people in Canada that would be disenfranchised if we got rid of vouching at the federal level. And the Supreme Court agreed with that argument and prevented the Conservative government from doing away with vouching at the federal level. But suddenly we have this part of Bill 20 that's being introduced here with nobody talking about it. And my worry is it's going to disenfranchise tens of thousands of Albertans to catch maybe 5 more people over the next decade from impersonating voters. But more than that, it's going to sow even more distrust in the election system, because what we know from south of the border is voter ID states don't stop at voter ID. Once they realize that the fear around nefarious activities around people cheating in elections, which are, by the way, thinly veiled in xenophobic, anti-immigrant sentiments that non-citizens are somehow voting in elections.
Right.
Once you plant that seed and you realize that voter ID isn't enough to stop that, right? So in Alberta, if you use voter ID and you say everybody has to bring a driver's license to prove that they have to vote, well, guess what? A driver's license is not a citizenship document. So
Exactly. Right.
Citizens have one. So what happens in these states in the U.S. is they realize voter ID doesn't solve the fears that they've created with this pronouncement. So they have to continually up the requirements, right? So now you have to register, and then you have to register 6 months in advance, and then you have to follow these other rules so that only the right type of people are voting. And to me, this is an important slippery slope that we need to stop now, because it ultimately it's governments getting to choose their voters instead of voters choosing their governments. So all of this goes to this sowing of distrust in our electoral system that, to me, only ends us up in a bad place where we lose that loser's consent, which is part of our democracy. We should be able to accept the results from an independent election authority, staffed by people who we trust, that are not blatant partisan appointments, right?
Yeah. Now, I wanted to, there are 2 more questions I want to pursue with you, Jarrett, in the next 7 or 8 minutes. And the first one is, you had mentioned Take Back Alberta, and they're part of a grassroots, or so they claim, organization that has a number of seats on the provincial council. In the last election, there were similar types of organizations, the Alberta Institute, Project Confederation, and the Free Alberta Strategy, that worked in Common Sense, Edmonton and Calgary, worked together, similar web backgrounds and so on. And I just, ultimately, it's all about the people behind these movements, whether they're corporately funded plutocrats or just citizens that are upset about carbon taxes and so on. And I also have noticed that Alberta Strong and Free, which was the UCP term, is also Canada Strong and Free, which is the old Preston Manning network. So in your research, and I have to think about the influence from the United States as well, creeping into Alberta politics. You talked about the sort of the Jim Crow types of registration groups. So maybe just talk a little bit about that. And then as a final question, I want to come back to, well, what do we do as citizens?
Yeah, well, I mean, the one point of influence that you didn't mention about the far right wing movements in Alberta, because it's not just one movement. Take Back Alberta itself has contested leadership, and there's a lot of folks that we would naturally assume would associate with Take Back Alberta that if you even hint that they might be part of that group, will say, I'm not with them, right? So the notion that there is one far right movement in Alberta or globally is a bit of a misnomer. But I think the other source of influence that we don't talk enough about is Russian influence. And we do have Elections Canada and CSIS reports that showed during the last provincial election in Alberta that the Russians were actually quite active in social media in sowing the misinformation and disinformation and distrust that serves to divide us into different factions and keep us from being focused on important matters that are democratic and things that obviously Russia would rather we not spend our time talking about, right? So we have evidence of that. But to your broader point, I mean, this is not there's not one far right wing movement, and I think we'll see that at play in the upcoming municipal elections in Alberta, particularly in Calgary and Edmonton, because as part of Bill 20, they brought in this legislation that will allow people to declare their party affiliation on ballots in the two major cities. And already, by my count, there's at least 3 conservative parties that have either established and are ready to register or about to register. And each of them is not run by a different ideology necessarily, but different personalities. And that's the irony, is that the United Conservative Party was formed to keep all of these forces in check behind one leader. Well, that was, at the time, was Jason Kenney, against one enemy. And at the time, that was the New Democrats and the federal Liberals in Ottawa. Well, the federal Liberals in Ottawa, by most accounts, are going to disappear as that foil in the next federal election. I don't see any poll that's pointing to any source of hope for them in returning to a majority government situation. So they were going to be left with a right wing that's really got to redefine itself. Who are our enemies now? If it's not Trudeau in Ottawa and we can't hold things together and standing up for Alberta against a marauding Liberal Party of Canada, then who is the enemy? And historically, Conservatives have turned on each other more than they've turned on other forces, which is why the United Conservative Party formed in the first place, because the Wild Rose and PCs were at each other's throats. So I'd be interested what happens in the next year and a half or so leading up to the municipal elections, see whether this actually fractures that movement.
Right. Now, the final question about what you recommend for civic engagement and community involvement and so on. But I also want to throw in this other one is to the incoming leader of the Alberta NDP, whoever he or she is, what type of advice would you give him or her on how to position the party as an advocate of supporting democratic institutions, checks and balances, and so forth?
Yeah, my piece of advice about that they're asking me is that they need to find unusual suspects, right? So the challenge that New Democrats have had in most recent elections is that they tend to line up people that we would predict would vote New Democrat. And they tend to be from cities, they tend to be from high levels of post-secondary education and so on. But what the UCP has done with Bills 18 and 20 has really revealed a crack in the Conservative coalition. There's a lot of people that are questioning whether, and this is in rural areas, right, are questioning whether the provincial cabinet, for example, should be allowed to remove elected politicians from local councils or to overturn bylaws that they support. And so it's freed up a lot of, as you put it, Democrats. Right? Small d Democrats, people who believe in the democratic process. And Conservatives historically in this province have been big champions of that.
Right.
And so if there's a way for the NDP to avoid the kind of factionalistic progressive versus conservative discussion and start talking, as they already have, if you look at their messaging, Max Fawcett did a piece on how it was Dave Cornway that pointed out their slogan is, talking about UCP wanting more power all the time, everywhere, right? This consolidation of power. I think that kind of message and showing that they're open, the New Democrats are more open and more democratic and supportive of these systems of pluralism that we talked about off the top of this interview. I think there's room there. And if they can present themselves as a party that's a champion of democracy, that's something that is a core Alberta value.
Well, that's a good way to end the conversation, that we need to sow the seeds for more discussions with our neighbors and community leaders on these signals that power is being consolidated. And one of my concerns too, just to finish, is the whole Alberta police force, the sheriffs, and that issue around what is also associated with the encampments at both universities and the encampments, particularly in Edmonton, where the use of police force and the question. It would be an interesting FOIP request, which I don't think you would get any answers to, but as to what kind of communications went between the Premier's office or the public safety minister and police chiefs and that sort of thing. So Jared, thank you very much for the work you do. Thank you very much for your time and your insights. And hopefully we can have a little bit of a chat in a year or two and see where Alberta is heading. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Bob.